My mom waited until the candles were blown out, until everyone clapped, until my sister Natalie stood glowing in her red dress, diamond bracelet flashing under the chandelier light. That's when she laughed and said, loud enough for all 50 guests to hear, "At least one of my daughters has a real job." The laughter that followed wasn't cruel. It was worse. It was polite. The kind of laughter people give when they don't want to be uncomfortable. I was standing near the dining table holding a tray of champagne glasses. I had poured myself. My hands didn't shake. I didn't drop the tray. I didn't defend myself. I smiled, because I had already decided what I was going to do. My name is Andrea Keller. I'm 32 years old. 3 years ago, I left my corporate accounting job at Grayson and Pike to build my own bookkeeping practice. It started small. 2 clients, then 4, then 8. By last quarter, I was managing financial records for 12 local businesses and clearing more than I ever did in corporate. But to my family, it wasn't real. It was cute. It was temporary. It was something I would grow out of once I wanted stability. My younger sister Natalie, on the other hand, was stability embodied. Law school graduate, junior associate at a mid-size firm, engaged to a corporate attorney whose parents owned a lake house. Natalie had the job title, the office, the business cards, the structured life. I had invoices, and apparently that meant I didn't count. The party was held at my parents' house in Brookfield. Big white colonial, double staircase foyer, hardwood floors that my mother polished every other week. Everything about it looked secure, established, impressive. What nobody at that party knew was that security had been hanging by a thread for almost 2 years, and I was the one holding it together. I arrived Friday evening to help with prep. That meant I planned the menu, coordinated the catering supply pickup, ordered custom cookies shaped like gavels because Natalie thought it would be adorable, printed the menu cards, and arranged the seating chart. I paid for half of it because Mom said cash flow was tight until Dad's investments rebounded. Cash flow had been tight for a while. 3 years ago, my father made a strategic move with retirement funds that didn't age well. A commercial real estate investment stalled mid. Then interest rates rose. Then the refinancing terms changed. They never told Natalie. They told me because I understood numbers. For the last 18 months, I had been quietly managing their mortgage restructuring, negotiating rate extensions, consolidating debt, and covering 2 tax shortfalls they didn't have liquidity for, not as a favor, as survival. When Mom made the real job comment, she wasn't being intentionally vicious. That's the thing that makes it sting more. She genuinely believed it. In her mind, Natalie had prestige. I had flexibility. Prestige wins at parties. Flexibility washes dishes. You're the only one without a real job, she added lightly, smiling at guests like she'd just made a charming joke. Natalie laughed softly. I let my sister's eyes. She didn't look embarrassed. She looked relieved. Relieved that for once, the spotlight wasn't on her. I set the champagne tray down, excused myself quietly, and walked into my father's study. The room smelled like old leather and printer toner. His mahogany desk sat under a framed certificate from 1994 when he won Regional Sales Excellence. I sat down in his chair and opened my laptop. The 3 emails were already drafted. I had written them earlier that afternoon, not because I expected humiliation, but because I expected inevitability. Email 1 was to the church treasurer. For the last year, I had been reconciling the church's donation accounts, because Mom volunteered there and the previous accountant left abruptly. No one knew I was doing it. They assumed the church just ran smoothly. Email 2 was to their mortgage officer. The adjustable rate extension I negotiated expired at midnight Sunday. I had a renewal option ready to execute. Email 3 was to their personal accountant. I had been preparing documentation to minimize penalties on an overdue capital gains filing tied to Dad's failed investment. All 3 emails were scheduled. All 3 were polite. All 3 stated the same thing. Effective immediately, I will no longer be managing these accounts. Please direct all future correspondence to the primary account holders. I checked the time. 8:47 p.m. Cake was being served. I didn't hesitate. I hit send. Then I closed the laptop. Walked back into the living room. Natalie was opening gifts. Mom was basking in the approval of guests, complimenting her beautiful, accomplished daughter. Dad stood near the fireplace telling someone about his diversified portfolio. Mom's phone buzzed first. She glanced down casually, then frowned, then read again. "What is this?" she whispered. The church treasurer had replied immediately, apparently without my quarterly reconciliation reports. Their donation account discrepancy of $28,000 was now visible. Her phone buzzed again. Dad's did too. The mortgage officer's automated alert came through next. Rate extension expired. Variable adjustment triggered. Projected payment increase, $1,420 per month. Dad looked confused. "What's going on?" He muttered. Mom's face drained of color. The accountant's email arrived last. Subject line, urgent documentation required. Apparently, without the supporting files I had compiled, their penalty exposure would exceed $19,000. I stood near the dessert table, watching the quiet panic ripple outward. Natalie stopped opening gifts. Guests sensed something shift. Mom looked at me slowly. "What did you do?" she asked. I tilted my head slightly. Just stopped doing what I wasn't paid for. The room felt smaller now. Dad stepped toward me. "You handle those accounts." I did. I corrected. "For free." Mom's voice trembled slightly. "Why would you do this tonight?" I held her gaze. "You said I don't have a real job." She swallowed. "This is exactly what my job is." No yelling. No tears. Just clarity. Guests started checking their watches. The party energy dissolved into quiet discomfort. Natalie stared at me like she was seeing me for the first time. "You could have told us," she said. "I have," I replied softly. "For 3 years?" Silence. The chandelier hummed overhead. Dad looked down at his phone again. For the first time in my life, my mother didn't have a clever remark. She didn't laugh. She didn't redirect. She just stood there, speechless. And the cake. No one touched it. The silence after my mother asked, "What did you do?" was not dramatic. It was heavy, like the air had thickened, and everyone suddenly realized the music had stopped, but no one remembered how to turn it back on. My father looked down at his phone again, thumb scrolling quickly, eyes scanning numbers. He had never really understood, because I had always translated them for him. "The rate can't jump like that," he muttered, more to himself than to anyone else. "We extended it." I kept my voice steady. "I extended it." Natalie set the gift box down slowly. The tissue paper slipping from her hand, a few of her fiancé co-workers were pretending to examine the framed engagement photos on the mantel. But they were listening. Everyone was listening. My mother stepped closer to me, her voice lower now, almost pleading. "Andrea, this isn't the time for this." I tilted my head slightly. "You're right," I said calmly. "The time for this was months ago." My father finally looked up at me fully. The performative confidence was gone. "You can't just stop," he said. "Those accounts are complicated." "They're not complicated," I replied. "They're neglected." The word landed harder than I expected. He flinched slightly. I wasn't trying to wound him. I was stating a fact. For 18 months, I had reconciled their accounts at midnight, flagged irregular charges, negotiated payment plans, responded to audit notices, and filed extensions before penalties stacked. They didn't see the hours because the results were invisible. That's the problem with invisible labor. It works so well that people forget it exists. Natalie finally stood up and crossed the room toward us. Is this about what Mom said? She asked. I looked at her evenly. It's about what Mom believes. That silenced her. Because she knew. She had heard the comment. She laughed. Not maliciously, but comfortably. That was worse. My father exhaled sharply and glanced toward the guests, suddenly aware that the audience he had enjoyed earlier was now witnessing something else entirely. This isn't family business, he said through clenched teeth. It absolutely is, I replied. My mother's phone buzzed again. She looked down and went pale. The church treasurer had replied with a second message. Without the reconciliation files, the donation shortfall wasn't just a discrepancy. It required board review. This is ridiculous, my father snapped. You're embarrassing us. I held his gaze. You embarrassed me. That line didn't raise my voice, but it cut through the room cleaner than shouting would have. One of Nat's friends cleared her throat and whispered something about checking on the car. Two guests slipped toward the door. The energy had shifted from celebration to exposure. Dad rubbed his forehead and lowered his voice. Fine, we'll talk about compensation. There it was. The first acknowledgement that what I did had value. Not help, not kindness, value. It's not about compensation, I said. It's about boundaries. My mother looked confused. You've always helped, she said softly. I've always been expected to, I corrected. Natalie crossed her arms defensively. You could have just said no. I met her eyes calmly. I did. Tonight. That shut her up. Because saying no before tonight would have been dismissed. Tonight, the no had weight. My father stared at the paperwork on his phone, like it might reorganize itself into something manageable. If we don't renew that rate, what happens? He asked, voice quieter now. The mortgage increases by $1,400 a month, I answered, and the penalty exposure compounds. He swallowed. For the first time in my life, I saw him calculating without ego. My mother's composure cracked slightly. We can't afford that, she whispered. The guests who remained pretended not to hear, but their shoulders were tense. I stepped back slightly, creating physical space. You can, I said calmly. But not the way you've been doing it. Dad looked up sharply. What does that mean? It means transparency, I said. It means acknowledging that you've been relying on me to stabilize what you refuse to reorganize. Natalie's fiance finally spoke. Careful but curious. Sir, if the refinance was extended through Andrea's credentials, then she's technically the guarantor, right? My father shot him a look, but he didn't deny it. The fiancé continued gently. That would mean she assumed risk. The word risk echoed in the room. I nodded once. Exactly, for 3 years. I had assumed financial risk so that my father could maintain pride, and tonight he had reduced my career to a hobby. The irony was almost clinical. My mother looked between us like she was seeing the mechanics of her own household for the first time. Why didn't you tell us it was this serious? She asked quietly. I felt something inside me finally align, because every time I tried to discuss finances, Dad said not to worry about it. And every time I asked for respect, you told me to be patient. Silence. Dad's jaw tightened. So what now? He asked, not angrily, strategically. That question was different from earlier. Earlier it had been defensive. Now it was pragmatic. Now, I said evenly, we do this properly. Natalie's voice rose slightly. You're not going to sabotage my engagement party season over this. Turned to her slowly. Your engagement party season is not my financial responsibility. That hit her harder. Then the mortgage conversation. Because she had assumed it was. Dad inhaled deeply. What are you proposing? He asked. I took a step forward. We restructure the mortgage under full disclosure. We separate the church finances from personal liability. And I stop being your unpaid compliance department. My mother's eyes filled slightly. You're walking away. No, I said softly. I'm stepping back. There's a difference. Guests began slipping out quietly now. The cake sat untouched. The decorations suddenly looked excessive. My father stared at me like he was recalibrating who I was in his life. Not the helpful daughter. Not the mistake. Not the background support. Something else. You planned this, he said quietly. I prepared. I corrected. That word settled into the room like gravity. He nodded once, slowly. If you walk away completely, he said, this house collapses. I held his gaze. Then don't let it. That wasn't a threat. It was a mirror. For the first time, he saw the structure clearly. I wasn't destabilizing the house. I had been stabilizing it. And now that I stepped aside, the illusion of effortless security was gone. Natalie's voice softened. Are you leaving? She asked. I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence breathe. Then I said, not tonight. Because tonight was not about departure. It was about recalculation. And what they didn't know, yet what none of them knew, was that one more notification was scheduled to hit at midnight, and that one would change everything. Midnight came quietly, but the notification did not. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't loud. It was just a soft buzz from 3 separate phones at exactly 12 a.m., the kind of synchronized alert that makes people look down at the same time, without realizing they're about to see something that can't be unseen. We were still in the living room. Most of the guests had left under polite excuses. A few lingered awkwardly near the door. The cake had hardened slightly at the edges. My father's phone vibrated first, then my mother's, then Natalie's fiancé's, who had been copied by default, because he was listed as a secondary contact on one of the financial forms I handled. My father opened his email automatically, still in that half-distracted state of someone who believes nothing worse can happen after the worst has already happened. He read the subject line once. Then again, his shoulders stiffened. What is this? He asked quietly, but this time the question didn't carry accusation. It carried fear. I didn't rush to answer. I let him read. The email was from the county clerk's office, formal, polite, confirming receipt of updated documentation. Submitted earlier that afternoon. Updated documentation transferring the church's financial oversight to a accounting firm effective immediately, and notifying the board of trustees that the previous volunteer accountant me had stepped down. But that wasn't the part that hit him hardest. The second attachment was an internal audit summary that I had prepared over the past year but never finalized. It outlined not just discrepancies in the donation account, but the fact that the church's building fund had been used twice to temporarily cover my father's short-term liquidity. Gaps before being reimbursed. Reimbursed quietly. Reimbursed by me. My mother inhaled sharply. Harold, she whispered. He didn't respond. He was reading the line that stated clearly that if those internal transfers had been reviewed without correction, they could have triggered formal inquiry. Natalie stepped closer. Dad, what does that mean? He lowered the phone slowly. It means, he said hoarsely, your sister has been cleaning up more than we knew. That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I had ever heard him say publicly. But we weren't done. My mother's phone buzzed again. A second email, this one from the mortgage officer. The rate extension that expired that evening had now been officially marked non-renewed. However, because the property deed was registered under my name, I was the primary contact required for further negotiation. Without my consent, no new restructuring terms could be approved. That was the part that shifted everything. My father looked up at me slowly. Not angry, not shouting, calculating. "You're the controlling contact," he said. I nodded once. "Yes," he swallowed. "So without you, without me," I said calmly, "you negotiate from scratch." The word scratch sounded heavier than I intended, because scratch meant new credit review, new income verification, new documentation, and this time, without my credit profile stabilizing the numbers. The room felt smaller. The last two lingering guests quietly slipped out without saying goodbye. Natalie's fiance cleared his throat gently. "Sir, this is fixable," he said cautiously, "but it needs coordination." He looked at me. With Andrea, for the first time in years, my professional name held weight in that house. Not as a joke, as necessity. My father leaned back in his chair slowly. He looked older. Not physically, but structurally. Pride weighs more than people realize when it has to be set down. "You could have let us fall," he said quietly. "I still could," I replied. The honesty of that sentence hung between us. It wasn't cruel. It was factual. For 3 years, I had insulated them from consequences they never even saw. I had absorbed penalties, smoothed errors, rerouted funds, negotiated extensions, covered shortfalls, and rewritten payment timelines in the margins of my own calendar. And tonight, after being called a mistake in front of 50 people, I had simply stopped buffering the impact. My mother's composure broke first. She sat down slowly, hands covering her face. "I didn't know," she whispered. That sentence mattered, because it wasn't defensive. It wasn't dismissive. It was realization. Natalie stood very still, staring at me like she was trying to reconcile two versions of her sister, the helpful one in the kitchen and the one who controlled the structure of their financial stability. "Why didn't you tell us?" she asked. I looked at her gently. "Would you have listened?" She didn't answer. "Because we both knew the truth." My father exhaled heavily and rubbed his jaw. "You've been carrying this," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yes," I answered. "Alone." The word landed with more force than the deed had the day before. Alone. He nodded slowly, absorbing it. For a man who built his identity around authority, the realization that his daughter had been the silent backbone of his financial survival was not just humbling, it was destabilizing. "What do you want?" he asked again. But this time, it wasn't defensive. It was sincere. I didn't hesitate. "Respect," I said calmly. "And boundaries." He leaned forward slightly. "Define boundaries." That was new. He wasn't rejecting them. He was asking to understand them. "I will help," I said evenly. But not invisibly. Not without acknowledgement. Not without documented agreement. My mother lowered her hands from her face. "Agreement," she echoed. I nodded. "A written arrangement. Clear responsibilities. Clear expectations. No more silent labor." Natalie's fiancé nodded subtly, recognizing the professionalism of what I was proposing. My father studied me for a long moment. "And if I refuse?" he asked quietly. I met his gaze without blinking. "Then the structure stands as it is, meaning the lease, meaning the rate negotiation, meaning the exposure." The silence that followed was different from the silence of humiliation earlier. It was thoughtful, measured. Finally, my father nodded once, slowly. "Draft it," he said. That was the shift. Not a scream. Not an apology. A decision. The man who had publicly diminished my career hours earlier was now asking me to formalize the very thing he had dismissed. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply walked to the study, opened my laptop again, and began drafting the agreement. And as I typed, I realized something neither of them fully understood yet. The envelope hadn't destroyed the family. It had revealed it. And once revealed, it could never go back to pretending. I drafted the agreement at my Father's desk while the house sat in a silence that felt heavier than any shouting could have been. The glow from the desk lamp cast long shadows across the wall where framed family photos hung, birthdays, graduations, holidays, all of them showing smiles that looked effortless because I had always made the logistics effortless. Behind the scenes, I typed calmly, precisely, the same way I drafted compliance documents for corporate clients. Section 1. Mortgage responsibility shared proportionally based on income, documented monthly. Section 2. Church financial oversight reassigned permanently to licensed third party. Section 3. Any additional financial consulting provided by me billed at standard professional rate, payable within 30 days. Section 4. Public acknowledgement at next family gathering correcting prior statements regarding my career and contributions. No drama, no revenge clauses, just structure. When I turned the laptop around toward my father, he read every word. Slowly, he didn't skim this time. He didn't wave it off. He read it like a man who had finally realized paper carries more weight than volume. My mother stood behind him, one hand resting lightly on the back of his chair. Natalie hovered near the doorway, quiet in a way I had never seen before. "You're charging us?" my mother asked softly. "If you hire me," I replied evenly. "Yes." My father exhaled through his nose. "You never charged before." "That was my mistake," I said gently. He looked at me sharply at that word mistake, but he didn't argue, because he understood what I meant. The agreement wasn't punishment, it was correction. After a long silence, he reached for a pen. His hand paused above the signature line for just a second, the weight of pride battling the weight of reality. Then he signed. My mother signed next, her handwriting smaller and more careful. Natalie didn't need to sign legally, but she stepped forward anyway. "I'll adjust my expectations," she said quietly. That was as close to an apology as she knew how to get. When the final signature dried, the room felt different. Not triumphant, not celebratory, balanced. The next Sunday, at my aunt's house, my father stood up before dessert. No fork tapping, no smirk. "I need to correct something I said last week," he began. The room stilled. He didn't look at his beer this time. He looked directly at me. "My daughter does have a real job, and she's been carrying more of this family than I ever acknowledged." It wasn't poetic. It wasn't dramatic, but it was public, and that mattered. My aunt nodded approvingly. Two cousins glanced at me with new expressions: respect instead of pity. My mother squeezed my hand under the table. Natalie added quietly, "Andrea runs her own firm." That small sentence carried more weight than she probably realized. It reframed me. Not as the helpful sister, not as the flexible daughter, as a professional. The weeks that followed weren't magically perfect. Boundaries don't erase history overnight. My father still slipped into old tones sometimes, but he caught himself more often than not. The mortgage was restructured under full transparency. Payments were automated. No more whispered emergencies. The church hired an external accountant. The donation discrepancy was resolved formally. Natalie began asking me about client management, not mockingly, but curiously. And for the first time, when I arrived at family dinners, I was a guest, not the staff. 3 months later, my father stopped by my apartment, unannounced. He stood in my doorway awkwardly, hands in his jacket pockets. "I've been thinking," he said. I let him speak. I confused leadership with control. The sentence was simple, but it carried decades of correction. "You didn't raise a mistake," he added quietly. "You raised someone stronger than me." That was the closest he would ever come to an apology, and I understood that. I nodded once. "We're stronger when it's shared," I replied. He gave a small, almost reluctant smile, and then he left. I stood there for a moment in the quiet of my own apartment. the space I paid for, the business I built, the life I chose. The envelope had not been about humiliation. It had been about recalibration. The scream had not been victory. It had been ego cracking under documentation. And what remained after the noise settled was something steadier than pride. Respect. Not demanded, not performed, earned. The next Father's Day, I arrived at noon with a bottle of wine instead of trays of food. My mother had catered the meal. My father grilled quietly. When he raised his glass this time, he didn't joke. He simply said, "To family that stands on its own feet." And when our eyes met across the yard, there was no audience performance left, only understanding. The envelope had changed everything. But not because it destroyed us. Because it forced us to rebuild correctly.